Welcome back to the channel and a new episode that I've been talking about doing forever of Horror Corner with Jess, darling. I'm Jess, and today we're finally going to get around to talking about one of my favorite one of my favorite movies of all time, really. Tucker and Dale versus Evil. If you haven't heard about this movie, go check it out. It is absolutely, it's hilarious and horrifying. And hilarious again, and then horrifying again, and it's just a great movie. We're going to talk about all things Tucker and Dale versus Evil today. But especially, so in my video on horror comedy, which you should check out if you haven't already, I'm going to try to organize these horror episodes into playlists so you can find them a little bit easier, but you should definitely check out that video if you haven't already. So in that video, I talk about how genre subversion is one way that horror comedies sort of find their comedic beats without being too funny and not scary enough. Like, for instance, the infamous wood chipper scene. If you haven't seen the movie, this scene is quite, it made me go the first time I watched it, if we're being honest. It is both horrifying, but the way that it happens, the reason it happens, is absolutely hilarious. But that hilarity doesn't take you out of the horror, which is what that video talked about. So over time, the more that I watch this movie, because I like it so much, it stopped being funny though, and started making me uncomfortable, and I didn't really understand why until I started learning about what the basis is of this hillbilly cannibal mountain men subgenre is. And, you know, frankly, the basis of this subgenre is fear of the other, but the other is explicitly autistic coded and physically disabled, you know, in some way, whether it's facial difference or limb difference. It is directly linked to ableism towards those two groups of people. For those of you who are unfamiliar with sort of, you know, the gist or the premise of the film, it is a satire, before anybody gets their panties in a bunch about any perceived criticism. I do understand that it is a satire, it is a parody, it is not meant to be, you know, this is really how we feel about these people. I get that. But it's supposed to be a satire of the inbred hillbillies in the mountains subgenre. But this particular story takes a Gregory Maguire-esque, if you will, approach to storytelling by having the group that you think, right, that you think are the good people, that you think are the innocent people, are the ones who are going to end up being the bad guys, right? So this group of teenagers comes across these two hillbilly mountain men who are redecorating and redoing the area around their vacation cabin, and they mistakenly think that they're inbred cannibals, you know, who want to kill them. So every time I sit down to record, something out there goes insane. Anyway, I'd like to reiterate that I am more than familiar with the kinds of reactions that non-autistic people have that when you're told that this is a problematic portrayal of autism, or the way that this character is portrayed and the way they're treated can be construed as anti-autistic behavior. It's just a story. It's just a movie. It's fiction. Before you head to the comments to crucify me, I'm not trying to cancel Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Don't embarrass yourselves thinking that I'm criticizing this movie for being anti-autistic. It is anti-autistic, but the way that it flips the script, the people who are being anti-autistic and ableist are not getting rewarded for this behavior. Right? Like, this movie is ableist to its core. You cannot deny that. Dale isn't trying to be creepy when he goes up to speak to this attractive woman, right? Like, he's not trying to telegraph that he's some sort of cannibalistic, wants to kill her, right? And the reason he gets rejected, like, if you watch just that scene, right, the reason he gets rejected, I'm sure, is gonna it felt to me like I'm getting emotional flashbacks, right? Like, it feels familiar to autistic people, probably especially cis autistic men. The fact is that this initial interaction and the miscommunication that followed, the fact is horror movies use this sort of setup, like ones that aren't trying to subvert the genre or say something different. This is what usually, leads to, the introduction of how depraved and messed up these future villains are going to be. And that's what's supposed to, begin instilling the sort of anticipatory dread in the viewer as it goes along. Like, if we've all seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? Where every single person that they try to go to for help ends up being a part of the Sawyer family. And so it's very obviously meant to be, like, you're meant to be made uncomfortable by Tucker and Dale until you realize what the movie is about, until you realize that the movie is about this genre subversion. I have to ask, and because I have it in my script, and I'm genuinely, I want to know real answers. I need to get water. I genuinely do not enjoy how insane my house is on Saturdays, because I have to work, and Saturdays are the worst days. But I have my water, and we shall continue. I have to ask, for those of you who are not autistic, is this really, when you watch interactions like that, and then you hear from people that, yes, these characters are autistic coded, Dale is literally existing as himself. And the miscommunication comes from him just existing as himself. Is this is really how you guys see autistic people? It really? Really? And that's why we need to talk about how harmful movies that genuinely revel in this sort of problematic aspect that we need to do something to change that, because it's very obviously anti-autistic, and it very obviously contributes to the idea that autistic people should be feared, or, you know, that we can't control ourselves, that kind of thing. And like, it's just no. No. Something else I realized while whenever I decide to talk about how I feel about a movie, one of the things I do is look into what other people are saying about the film. So one of the things that I realized was that out of all the criticisms of this movie, like, people just largely didn't understand that it was meant to be mocking people who engage in ableism. Like, it's like that level was completely invisible to others. Like, even people with articles titled Tucker and Dale versus the Patriarchy, like, do we not understand that part of dismantling the patriarchy is understanding intersectionality, and that, yes, Dale is a creepy cishet man, quote unquote, but a lot of creepy cishet men are really just autistic men who don't understand social cues, or, you know, maybe have context blindness when it comes to how to interact with people. Like, they talk about misogyny, toxic masculinity. One article even went in depth into the fat phobia that Dale experiences from these people, but like, nobody else got that Dale is autistic coded. Like, I don't know. I just... as I was saying, this cannibal hillbilly mountain man subgenre relies on fear of the other, and to, you know, in order to, you know, build the fear that you're supposed to be experiencing. It's the same fear of the other that causes allistic people to have weird feelings around autistic people and not really be able to understand why. I used to follow this creator on Facebook, Growing Up Outie. He used to be Growing Up Aspie, but then decided to change his name when we started having more conversations about how problematic the term Asperger's is. He talks a lot about that weird feeling before people know you're autistic, they sense that you're autistic. And that is exactly the fear that Tucker and Dale versus Evil plays on. One analysis describes Tucker and Dale as a film that exposes society's bias against unlikely heroes. How is it that y'all get so close only to miss the point entirely? Who's a more unlikely hero than an autistic man? Like, disabled people are never the heroes. We're never the heroes of our own stories, and we're definitely not ever the heroes or protagonists of horror movies, but especially not off of this particular subgenre that is meant to play off fear of disability in the first place. Like, again, smack into the point, but still completely seem to miss it entirely. The fact the Dale in these, in these articles, in these analyses of this film, the Dale is often referred to as the opposite to Chad's toxic masculinity while being clearly autistic coded, exposes the genre for what it is. And I think that was kind of part of the point, is that no matter how you present disability in horror, it's pretty clear that able-bodied people are not the ones that have any business trying to talk about these issues without input from the communities that are affected. Because infantilizing Dale isn't the answer either. Like, we don't need to infantilize characters like Dale without making the point that having them be the villain is probably not a good idea either. And that's a huge part of, so despite being autistic coded, it's interesting because Dale is still presented as being kind and sensitive, and the ableism that he's experiencing comes from Chad's jealousy and toxicity, and is not necessarily a reflection of, like, they make sure to say this is toxic, this is Chad's view, not necessarily the worldview, and that is where Tucker and Dale got it right. That is where this film and the way that it's presented in this sort of flip-flop, fractured fairy tale kind of way, why it works for this movie and not for, some of the others. Because that's the thing, right? Like, this movie has inadvertently exposed the fact that it's possible to write good horror based on beloved tropes without relying on being problematic in order to, make your point or make your movie more compelling, right? Like, instead of glorifying the people that made the ableist assumptions about these potentially innocent people, right? This movie, instead of glorifying these people, this movie flings them shockingly straight into a wood chipper. With hilarious results, I might add. So, as much as fear of the other, in a straightforward, unironic way, has become such an effective way to scare people, like, The Hills Have Eyes, absolutely terrifying. And, like, I recognize that means I still have a lot of internalized ableism to unpack, but that the point is, it is a very effective way to scare people, but I think a better way to explore these issues is by flipping the script the way Tucker and Dale did, and having the ableism and the ableist people punished rather than rewarded. Like, even if it were more straightforward and not a horror comedy or meant to be a satire, Chad's character would still be a really effective way at saying, hey, we don't reward this kind of behavior, right? Like, the fact that autistic and able people, like, you can't even recognize anti-autistic ableism, like, in particular when it's shoved down your throat. So I do have a feeling that this will probably be something that, we'll have to discuss, in-house within the autistic community, but really, horror is such a common special interest for autistic people, for neurodivergent people in general. Like, I know a lot of people with ADHD who will hyperfixate on horror because of the dopamine release. I'm sure that we can, that we'll figure it out. But I do think that going forward, these conversations do need to be had. One of the beautiful things about the horror community and about horror, the genre in general, is that, you know, it is always evolving, and, you know, we work as a collective of artists and consumers, you know, writers, actors, from the tech side to the, to the consumption side, like watching it, you know, going to parties, whatever. And it's always trying to be a better version of itself. There's never been a point in time where horror has said, we don't care about progressing past where we've found ourselves at in this moment. And that's part of the reason why I love the horror community so much, is because of the willingness of creators to take criticism and make it a more accepting place. You know, make the community more accepting. I've recently posted a story about, you know, everybody's all about marginalized representation in the horror community until it comes to checking your ableism. So this is something that really, you know, I think needs to be talked about instead of shied away from, because we've shown that we're capable of having difficult conversations, right, as a community. Filmmakers like Jordan Peele, right? Nia DaCosta, who directed Candyman, which was executive produced by Jordan Peele, I just found out, ironically. They are already leading the genre into the next frontier. Like, it's already progressing past this need to rely on bigoted tropes in order to scare people. Like, nobody goes into a Jordan Peele movie thinking they're gonna have to deal with anything problematic. Like, no matter what Jordan Peele movie you're walking into, and it's a good step, but we need to take it further and continue to be listening to people, you know, to marginalized communities, because, you know, it's 2022, and it's time that we start recognizing that it doesn't work to rely on the fear of being marginalized or becoming marginalized to, you know, to scare people. Like, that, we don't have to do that anymore in 2022. It doesn't have to rely on people's internalized bigotry in order to be terrifying. Like, if you look at Jordan Peele's Get Out, white people and black people found it bone-chillingly terrifying for two separate reasons. But there are people who found it scary. There are people who were terrified by Nope. I was profoundly disturbed by that movie and haven't been able to watch it again because of how unsettling it was. You don't have to rely on internalized bigotry to scare people anymore. You just don't. And, like, really, if you think about it, as we reach, you know, this post-COVID, you know, where we're not not really post-COVID, but sort of. We're, like, post the realization that COVID is going to be a thing long term, right? Like, things like cannibalistic hillbillies, rural serial killers, right? Like, movies like Wolf Creek, they're not the most terrifying things that we can conceive of anymore. Like, I'm sure a lot of people in Appalachia were, like, standing on their porches, staring at the tree line, thinking, come take me away from whatever hell I've got going on, handed down from the Republicans, you know, who gerrymandered the crap out of my state and took away my right to vote. Like, at this point, it's just, we don't need this subgenre to be, you know, the way that it was anymore. Like, if we're gonna continue to make movies in this subgenre, they need to evolve past. And I think that this movie, Tucker and Dale, like, it works. It works as far as moving past relying on internalized bigotry and calling it out instead and making you face it instead. So thank you for listening to me. I know that it gets a little bit like, you know, the horror community really doesn't like getting political. Like, the number of times that Janice has had to say, oh, won't dead meat. Like, if you are not woke to some degree, then you are really in the wrong community. Like, just as a rule, honestly, like, nothing about horror seems straight or cis to me at all. Like, I talked in my body horror episode about how that particular subgenre is especially queer, but like, no. Horror is not for normies. And if you are cis and straight and abled, I feel like you could be welcome in the community, but only insofar as you defer to the people who are calling out the queerness, right? So that brings me to my episode on analog horror that is coming. I believe that analog horror and this concept of using liminal space as a way of instilling fear in people, I believe that that is the future of horror. You don't have to be so... I'll go into it more. Analog horror is web-based, right? But I really, really believe that it has the potential to be the future of what really terrifies people, right? Because found footage kind of played out. This, though, is a new twist on it that's really, really fascinating and has been really interesting for me to learn about researching liminal space. It's kind of triggered some existential dread inside of me, if you will, but it gave me a lot to think about as far as, you know, my personal relationship to sitting with discomfort. So if you are interested more in what I think the future of the horror genre will be, and if you're interested in learning a little bit about analog horror, that's going to be my next horror-related episode. And then Object Constancy, as I said, I'm hoping to get that out sometime by next Friday. So I've got the script, so I'm going to hopefully be able to get all the editing done once the recording is through. Also, I have a new podcast episode coming out. I'm thinking of scaling back and only trying to do a podcast episode every 2 weeks. I think trying to have 2 uploads a week, video-wise, plus the podcast every week was just too much. So, but I have an episode recorded. I just need to post it. So stay tuned for that. And if you're not, you should be. I know that there's a lot of like places to follow, 2 specific places where you should subscribe. Here on YouTube, because I have such an inconsistent upload schedule because of work, the holidays, my kids. I never know when my chronic illness is going to take me out. So make sure that you subscribe, hit the notification bell here, but also I don't know that you can set Spotify up to notify you when your favorite podcasts have new uploads. So the easiest way to make sure that you don't miss any podcast episodes is to subscribe at Anchor. I'll put my Anchor URL up on the screen. Subscribing to my podcast also gives you the ability to leave feedback in the form of a voice message, and then those can be downloaded and shared in future videos. So if you want to give feedback about podcast episodes, that's the best way to do that. Otherwise, you can also find me on Instagram, and all that stuff will be in the end card. So that is Tucker and Dale versus Ableism. And I'm trying to think. Oh, I am still going on my ABCs of Fright series. As soon as I get... I'm pretty sure that I'm going to have to wait until the new year, because I also want to start a series on... My ex-husband, right, has this whole collection. Like, I have a whole stack of them. And I decided that I wanted to talk about children's horror, like stuff like this that's meant to get kids into scary stuff, right? Like, I'm sure everybody in the horror community had some of these. Yeah, so not just going into horror for children, but maybe exploring some of these old Goosebumps books too, and see if any of the horror in these books stands up. I know y'all are thinking they're not gonna pull out the one with the dummy on the cover. Like, don't pull out the one with the dummy on the cover, but we're gonna talk about the one with the dummy on the cover. So make sure that you are keeping up, because I'm really, like, I'm excited. I'm excited to read the books again. I'm excited to talk about Goosebumps and Arlstein again. So that is that. That is it for this episode, and I will see you guys in the next one.